This move, 1. e4, immediately stakes a claim in the center of the board, opening diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, and is a foundational move in many popular chess openings, aiming for rapid development and central control. This move directly mirrors white's central pawn advance, leading to a classic open game where both sides fight for central control and aim to develop pieces rapidly. This develops a piece towards the center, controls key central squares d4 and e5, and prepares to castle, setting up for a standard Ruy Lopez or Italian game opening. This move develops a piece towards the center and supports the e5 pawn, leading into the foundational lines of many classical openings like the Ruy Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Ruy Lopez, a classical opening where white immediately pressures black's central pawn and knight, aiming to create imbalances and control the center. This move, a6, is known as the Morphy defense, a common and principled response in the Ruy Lopez opening that challenges white's bishop and aims to gain space on the queenside. This move maintains the pin on the knight, preparing for the Ruy Lopez main lines and challenging black's pawn's intention to gain space on the queenside. This move, known as the Berlin defense, challenges white's bishop and prepares to counterattack the center, opening up a complex strategic battle. Castling kingside secures the monarch and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental strategic goal in most openings, while also bringing a piece closer to the center. This move, 5. d6, develops a central pawn, reinforcing e5 and preparing to develop the bishop on c8. A common pawn structure in the Ruy Lopez that aims for a solid and active defense. This move abandons the traditional doubled pawn structure often seen in the Ruy Lopez, opting instead to trade a bishop for a knight, which can lead to a favorable pawn majority in the center for white if black recaptures with the b-pawn. By recapturing with the b-pawn, black creates doubled pawns, which weakens their pawn structure but opens the b-file for the rook and removes white's active bishop, fundamentally altering the pawn dynamics. This move aims to open the center, creating dynamic play and utilizing the central pawn majority while exploiting black's doubled c-pawns as a structural weakness. Black recaptures towards the center, opening the e-file and aiming to challenge white's central pawn presence, while also creating a doubled pawn on the c-file for white which will require careful management. White recaptures the pawn on d4 with the knight, centralizing this piece and opening lines for development while creating a doubled pawn for black on the c-file. Developing the bishop to e7 reinforces the center and prepares for kingside castling, while also unblocking the dark-squared bishop's diagonal. This move reinforces the knight's central control and prepares for potential pawn advances while white has a lead in development. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, preparing to castle kingside and support the center. White develops the bishop to a strong attacking square, pinning the knight and preparing to exploit black's doubled c-pawns and potential weaknesses in the queenside pawn structure. Black's king has found safety by castling, solidifying the king's position and preparing for potential counterplay in the center. This move prepares to develop the queen to an active square, supporting the center and potentially eyeing the kingside for future attacks. This move, re8, strategically repositions the rook to the semi-open e-file, preparing for potential central pawn breaks or to support an advance of the e-pawn, while also indirectly defending the knight on c6. Redeploying the rook to the e-file supports potential central pawn advances and prepares for future coordination with the queen and other pieces on this open file. This pawn move prepares to challenge white's active bishop on g5, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially create weaknesses in black's kingside structure later. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest control of the central dark squares and potentially prepare for future advances or exchanges that could weaken black's pawn structure. This move, c5, challenges white's central control and aims to open lines for black's pieces, potentially creating a queenside majority if the c-pawn can advance further. This move ventures the knight to an aggressive outpost on f5, aiming to pressure black's kingside and potentially create tactical opportunities after gxf6, weakening the pawn structure. Black exchanges the bishop for the knight to eliminate white's aggressive piece and avoid potential pawn structure weaknesses after a later d5 push. This pawn capture on f5, while seemingly simple, significantly alters black's pawn structure by creating doubled pawns on the c-file, which can become weaknesses, and simultaneously opens the e-file for white's rook, providing future attacking possibilities. This move prepares to redeploy the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting an advance on the queenside or reinforcing the center. This move aims to prevent black's bishop from becoming too active on the h4-d8 diagonal and to prepare potential pawn advances on the kingside later in the game. This move prepares to challenge white's central control and potentially activate the queenside majority by creating an advanced passed pawn on a5. This move repositions the rook to a more flexible central file, potentially supporting a future advance on the queenside or preparing to challenge black's queenside pawn majority. This move shifts the knight to a less active square for now, likely aiming to reposition it to g5 or f6 later to support an eventual kingside attack or to defend against white's pawn advances. This move resolves the immediate tension and clarifies white's pawn structure, opening the e-file for potential future rook activity and creating a clear target for black's queen. The rook now occupies the open e-file, supporting the central pawn majority and preparing to challenge white's control of this important line. This exchange resolves white's doubled pawns on the c-file and opens the e-file for white's rook, creating dynamic attacking potential. This recapture re-establishes material equality and opens the e-file for black's queen, which can now potentially coordinate with the rook. This knight move exerts strong pressure on the d-pawn and prepares to activate the knight to a more central square, potentially targeting black's king or weaknesses. This move offers to trade queens, which white likely welcomes given the potential initiative on the kingside and slightly better pawn structure. The recapture on e1 aims to centralize the rook, contesting the open e-file and preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece activity on the kingside. The move re-centers the rook on the open e-file, aiming to contest control with white's own rook and improve its defensive and offensive potential along that critical central file. This exchange of queens simplifies the position and enters a favorable endgame for white, who retains a central pawn majority and a more active king once the remaining pawns are cleared. Black recaptures the rook, simplifying the position and accepting a slightly more passive pawn structure on the queenside due to white's advanced e-pawn. This move centralizes the queen, aiming to increase pressure on black's kingside and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece maneuvers. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active central square, supporting potential pawn advances and eyeing the weakened dark squares on white's kingside. This move initiates a queen trade, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit white's advantage in pawn structure and king safety. By exchanging queens, black simplifies the position and enters an endgame where white's knight on d5 poses an immediate threat to black's pawn structure on the queenside. This exchange of queens leads to an endgame where white's knight, now centralized after capturing on e7, holds a positional advantage over black's king. The king now relocates from the center to a more secure position on f8, aiming to connect the remaining rooks and potentially participate in the endgame action. The knight repositions to the strong central outpost on d5, aiming to control key squares and potentially attack the weakened pawn structure on the queenside. This move repositions the king to a more central and active square, aiming to support the remaining pawns and potentially participate in the endgame maneuvering. This knight sacrifice exploits the unprotected status of the c7 pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially win material. The move is a logical step to consolidate the king's position and prepare for active play in the endgame, aiming to control central squares and potential pawn advances. This knight maneuver aims to re-establish white's central pawn control and contest the d5 square, preventing black's king from finding a safer outpost and potentially creating tactical opportunities. This move aims to regroup the king for the endgame, seeking active squares and potentially supporting a central pawn advance while avoiding discovered checks. This move aims to secure the central pawn majority and create a connected passed pawn on the queenside, which can be a significant advantage in the endgame. The knight repositions to a more active central outpost, aiming to control key squares and potentially support a pawn advance on the queenside. This exchange simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where white aims to exploit the potential pawn weaknesses on black's queenside. This pawn recapture opens the g-file for black's rook and creates an isolated pawn on f6, which will likely become a target for white's pieces. This move shores up the queenside pawns and prepares to utilize the open c-file for potential infiltration or pressure. This move initiates a central pawn break to challenge white's superior pawn structure and activate black's pieces, aiming to create dynamic counterplay. This pawn move aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure, preventing black from creating further infiltration or pushing their central pawns unchecked. This move advances the central pawn to create a passed pawn, aiming to gain space and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside. This move is a reaction to black's advanced passed pawn on d4, aiming to create counterplay on the kingside and potentially free the f-file for a rook. After the exchange of queens, black's king needs to activate and centralize to participate in the endgame, which this move achieves by heading towards the more active center of the board. This move aims to create a protected passed pawn on the kingside and establish a more active pawn structure to control space, but it weakens white's kingside pawn defense significantly. The king advances to e7, aiming to centralize its position and participate in the endgame fight for space and potential pawn pushes, while also preparing to challenge white's pawn chain. The king activates into the center, preparing to support the pawns on the kingside and control crucial central squares as the endgame progresses. The king repositions to a more central and active square, aiming to support the pawn advance and contest the d4 pawn. This move consolidates the king towards the center, a standard endgame principle, to support the pawns and potentially participate in pawn races or control key squares. The move aims to consolidate the king's position, bringing it closer to the center of the board where it can potentially participate more actively in the endgame and support pawn advances. The king is now activated into the center, ready to support the advancement of the pawns and contest central squares. The king is actively participating in the endgame, seeking to control central squares and support potential pawn advances, a crucial maneuver in simplified positions. This move advances the kingside pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn on the kingside and restrict black's knight activity, while also potentially preparing to defend the kingside further. The king's repositioning to the kingside aims to support the potential advance of the f-pawn, aiming to break open lines for white's king. The move b4 aims to gain space on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn later by advancing the a-pawn. This move aims to improve black's pawn structure by creating a passed pawn on the queenside, potentially leading to dynamic play and counter chances. This pawn advance aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by forcing a pawn exchange, which will restrict black's king and pawns. The king's advance towards the center is a necessary part of endgame strategy to become active and support the pawn majority on the queenside. White's pawn push to g5 aims to create attacking chances on the kingside, potentially opening lines for the king and creating passed pawns, while black must remain vigilant to prevent pawn breaks and maintain kingside solidity. This pawn capture opens up the g-file for white's rook and allows white to pursue a kingside pawn advance, potentially creating a passed pawn or attacking black's king. The pawn capture on g5 opens the f-file for white's rook and creates a passed pawn on the kingside, while black's central pawn majority is now isolated and more vulnerable. The pawn capture opens the g-file for white's rook, creating immediate attacking potential against black's king, and white will likely follow up with kilogram 3 and possibly rf1 to exploit this newly opened line. The capture on g5 opens the h-file for white's rook and creates a passed pawn on the h-file, which will be a significant asset in the endgame. The pawn break on the queenside with b3 aims to activate the queenside pawn majority and create a passed pawn, potentially disrupting white's kingside attack and drawing material away from the center. The king's central advance towards the queenside pawns is a logical step to try and create passed pawns on the kingside while supporting the potential kingside pawn majority. The black king must be brought into play to support the pawn advance and contest the center, as white is preparing to advance their passed pawns. This move initiates a pawn race on the kingside, aiming to create a passed pawn that can threaten the black king and potentially force material concessions. This move, fxg6, breaks open the kingside pawn structure for black, but it comes at the cost of a weakened king position and opens the g-file for white's rook and king. Black is hoping to create some counterplay with this pawn break, potentially activating the h-pawn. But white now has clear attacking avenues. This pawn exchange clarifies the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn on the g-file for white and simplifying towards an endgame where white's king can become more active.